Grade 12 Economics. Please welcome Mr. Mhlongo. I'm back here with you today to take you on the economic issues, which is our chapter 4 of our economics. The topic we are covering today is inflation. Remember that inflation is a part of our paper 2, and in paper 2 we can come across the topic in section A, and then in section B it can be in question number 3 as a part of question 4 also, as well as question number 6. So please join me. Let's see what we have for you here. The following are the lesson objectives or outcomes that will be achieved during the course of this lesson. So at the end of this lesson, you will be able to do the following. You will be able to mention and describe different types of inflation. The lesson will also allow you to be able to briefly discuss inflation targeting of South Africa. You will also be able to briefly discuss causes of inflation. The lesson will allow you to be able to briefly discuss causes of demand pull and cost push inflation. You will also be able to discuss in detail consequences of inflation. That's an essay. The lesson will also allow you to be able to discuss in detail measures to combat inflation. It's also an essay. This is the lesson board or the structure of the lesson. So firstly, we have types of inflation. Inflation targeting in South Africa. The causes of inflation, effects of inflation, as well as measures to combat inflation. Basically, when we talk about inflation, we mean the significant increase in the general price level of goods and services. If prices are increasing significantly and consistently in various industries or in various sectors, that simply means inflation effect. If we talk of inflation, we don't mean the increase in the price of bread alone. We don't mean the increase in the price of a particular cloth alone, but we mean within the market, the variety of goods experiences the increase in prices, consistently so. Within the average or above the average of goods within the market or the entire market, goods are increasing in terms of price, and also services prices are increasing. Then we can regard that as inflation. That's why we say is a sustained or consistent or significant increase in the general price level of goods and services over a certain period of time. So as the inflation increases in the economy, or as prices increase significantly, that lead to the money we possess or the money we have losing its buying power. The money loses its purchasing power or buying power parity, because if prices are increasing significantly, and then the money we have tend to afford less of goods and services. Because of that, now it has some effects that are not good for the economy, because even the level of spending decline in the economy. So because of that, we have inflation targeting that was established in South Africa, which is between 3 to 6%, meaning the inflation rate should not increase above 6% and should not decrease below 3%. We call that the inflation target in South Africa. As in now, our current inflation rate is 7.4%, meaning it is above the target. And because of that, a certain intervention is necessary from the government. That's why we have seen South African Reserve Bank increasing the interest rate by 75 basis points. That is the measure to try reducing the money supply within the economy in order for the economy to experience less level of spending and of demand on goods and services. So let's continue with the concept of the inflation. Inflation is a sustained and a significant increase in the general price level of goods and services over a period of time. It occurs if prices are increasing continuously. Not just one price increases on one product, then we say it's an inflation. Significantly so, variety of goods invariant market should be increasing, then we can say we experience inflation. The increase in the prices should be across all goods and services. Across all goods and services, not limited to certain goods and services, across all. So then we can say we have inflation. We continue with the concept of the inflation. The increase in the inflation decreases purchasing power parity of money. So the money loses its buying power, meaning the money can afford less of goods and services, like I've said before. Money we have tend to afford less goods and services than previously. If the inflation has increased from 2021 as in 2022 now, that means the money we used to spend to afford particular goods and services cannot afford the same quantity of goods now in 2022 because the inflation has increased. That's why we say the money loses its buying power as inflation increases. The decrease in purchasing power is notable on consumer baskets as they buy goods and services with the same amount of money after a certain period. So it's simply notable on consumers as they buy goods and services. If you used 1,500 to buy a grocery in 2021, that simply means this year in 2022, you cannot afford the same quantity of goods with 1,500. You will afford less because we say the buying power parity of money drops because of the increase in inflation. The purchasing power parity or the buying power parity. Then this is an example. Assume that consumers budgeting 12,000 per month to afford all household goods and services. That was in 2019. So the budget is 12,000 to afford all of these goods and services. In the year 2020, because of the increase in inflation, consumers need to increase their budget to afford the same goods or the same quantity of goods and services. Now it goes to 13,500 because prices have increased significantly. If the consumer will still be willing to spend 12,000 to afford the same quantity of goods in 2020, the consumer will not be able to afford those goods because the money or the 12,000 rand have lost its buying power. Prices have increased. In 2021, prices continue to increase, resulting to budget constraints for households. 13,500 is no longer enough to afford household goods and services. Then the consumer or the household have to budget 15,000 in order to afford those goods and services he or she used to afford in 2020. Now, if the consumer bring 13,500 to afford same goods that he or she used to afford in the previous year, the consumer cannot afford those goods because of prices have increased significantly. The money have lost its buying power. So, 15,000 is the amount required for household to afford all goods and services. This simply indicates that as inflation increases, the purchasing power parity of money decreases. It affords less goods and services. So this is an image indicating the change in purchasing power parity. On the first image here, we have a rise of 1 kg being 30 rand 99, but increased from 25 rand 56 to 30 rand 99. And then we have a white bread 700 gram. It was 15 rand 57, now 17 rand 84. So prices keep on changing from lower to the higher amount, resulting to people not affording those goods and services with the similar amount they used to purchase with. So we call that the purchasing power parity. And then this is the example. We have a trolley in here holding on household goods and services. You can see the first trolley in there, that is 2019. It's loaded, it is full. There are so much goods in there. We assume that the consumer maybe is spending 12,000 during this year of 2019. And then the following year is 2020. With the same amount of money of 12,000, the consumer will only afford this basket, meaning the buying power parity have dropped. The consumer can no longer afford the similar quantity of goods he or she used to afford before. Therefore, less goods will be afforded by the consumer. You can see the basket is different now. This one was too much loaded and this one is a little bit smaller because the consumer is not willing to adjust the budget, keep the same amount, but now affordably so, the consumer will afford less goods and services. And then the following year, which is 2021, inflation increases significantly to the point that with the similar amount of 12,000 that was spent here, the consumer will afford even less goods and services. So that simply means as the inflation increases, the quantity of goods and services we afford with the similar amount, if we keep it consistently, will decline or will keep on dropping. We will end up affording less, which will always lead to less affordability, less goods and services being consumed by consumers or being demanded by consumers, and even lead to poverty within the society and the economy. The inflation target. Remember, if we talk of the inflation target, we mean the range that has been set by Reserve Bank and the government on the inflation rate, meaning the inflation should be floating within that particular range, should not go beyond, should not go below. If it happens that it goes above or beyond, there should be a certain intervention by the government and the Reserve Bank to ensure that that rate of inflation is alleviated or combated. If ever it goes below, the inflation should be caused because goods become relatively cheap within the economy, which does not benefit producers. Inflation target is the inflation range for which inflation must not exceed or go below. South African inflation target is between 3 to 6%, meaning inflation should not decline below 3%, should not increase beyond 6%. If so, if it goes beyond the intervention by the government should occur, or intervention by the Reserve Bank should occur, trying to reduce inflation. Inflation target helps to the central bank to easily monitor and stabilize inflation rate. So with the inflation targeting being there, it's easy for Reserve Bank to monitor and easily control the inflation rate, because with that range being set, the Reserve Bank can see if the inflation is above, then relevant measures can be taken or relevant intervention can be taken. If it goes below, a particular relevant intervention can also be undertaken to ensure that inflation rate goes between or within. Inflation rate is above, if inflation rate is above 6%, restrictive intervention is necessary by the government and central bank. We call that one restrictionary monetary policy and restrictionary fiscal policy. If inflation decreases below 3%, expansionary measures should be taken by both the government and the central bank, applying expansionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy. And then we continue with the target. Inflation target is the ideal inflation range for which, for inflation to move within. Doesn't go above or below, but simply keep on floating within. Inflation target is like a fence, and the inflation is the children that should play within the area. So inflation should not jump or escape. If ever it jumps, there must be intervention to bring it back to where it's supposed to be. Occasionally, the children jump the fence, but the South African Reserve Bank tries to bring the children back into the fence area or into the fenced area. So we have the inflation, and then with the inflation, there is a fence which is the target. That inflation target simply ensures that these children or inflation does not jump. If it jumps, Reserve Bank must intervene to bring it back to where it's supposed to be, which is to be within the target. Currently, the inflation rate in South Africa is 7.4%. Therefore, Reserve Bank increase in the repo rate. We have seen the increase in repo rate, ensuring that inflation comes back within the target range. 7.4% means that the children have jumped the fence, and South African Reserve Bank have to bring them back within the fence, because now they are beyond where they are supposed to be. Measuring inflation. How do we measure inflation? We use indexes, which is the CPI and PPI. We also use the weighting. So indexes are used to measure changes in general price level within the economy. We call that the consumer price index and the producer price index. The CPI, consumer price index. This one measures the basket of goods and services for typically South Africans. And then with the CPI, we mainly focus on the cost of living, because consumers are demanding finished goods or final goods so that they can be able to satisfy their needs and wants. So it mainly focuses on the cost of living. CPI consists of consumer goods and services because it simply represents consumers or prices on consumer goods. We continue with measuring inflation. When the CPI continues, it excludes the capital and intermediate goods. The reason why, remember, consumers are mainly using finished goods. They don't use capital goods. Capital goods are mainly for producers. That's why the CPI does not include the effect of capital goods, but it includes the effect of consumer goods. The value-added tax is included. We know that consumers normally buy goods and services within the market at the market price, where there's an effect of the value-added tax. Interest rate and prices of imported consumer goods are explicitly shown, meaning the interest rate as well as price on imported goods and services are shown because consumers are the one that most interact within the interest rate. Within the banking sector, they take some loans, they buy some goods and services produced with the capital borrowed from commercial banks, which is having interest rates. So that's why it is shown explicitly so in there. And also consumers also demand goods and services produced by other countries or from other countries. And then the next one is the producer price index, which is the PPI. The producer price index measures mainly the cost of production by businesses. So PPI measures prices of domestically produced goods and services, the cost of production. It doesn't measure the cost of living, it measures the cost of production, meaning it focuses on the side of businesses. PPI pertains the following: capital goods and intermediate goods. So in the PPI, or within the PPI basket, we have capital goods mainly because producers are the ones, or business are the ones that produce goods and services. So they use capital goods to produce goods and services. That's why we include the capital goods and intermediate goods, but then we exclude what we call the consumer goods, because now, or final goods, we mainly include the capital goods. Services are excluded. And then prices of imported capital goods are also included in there because those machines are used in production. So they add to the cost of production. Interest rates and VAT or value-added tax are not shown, they are excluded. And then we continue with measuring inflation. Then we talk about weighting. So to overcome the problem of differences in the importance of an item in an index, a weighted index number makes a figure directly comparable. So if you weight, it tends to be very easy to compare prices from one year to another, from 1 month to another, from one quarter to another. The weight reflects the relative importance of an item. If food is given a weight of 30% and housing a weight of 15%, it means that the change in price of food is twice as important as the change in price of housing, looking at figure that have just been provided here, because that means food then is having huge weight as compared to the weight of the housing. And then measuring inflation continues. Inflation rate. Now that's when we set the rate for inflation as for we calculate using the CPI or the consumer price index from the current year, previous year, etc. The inflation rate can be calculated as soon as the consumer price index has been calculated. So to calculate the inflation rate, there must be CPI figures being indicated or being calculated. Then after that, the inflation rate can be calculated because it mainly depends on the CPI. Inflation is always expressed as an annual rate. So we calculate inflation normally per year to say in 2020, we had this kind of the inflation rate, 2021, this kind, and also 2022, we have this inflation. They can also calculate it quarterly also. The most common practice is to compare the index for a particular month with the index of the corresponding month in a previous year on a yearly basis or year to year. Meaning if we talk about 2021 August, then we also compare to 2022 August. Then it's easy to compare. That's why we say it is mainly calculated or rated in a yearly basis. The result is expressed as a percentage increase. We continue with measuring inflation. The index for a particular month can be compared to index for the previous month within the same year. For example, a month to month. So in this case, we can compare July as well as August. Prices for July and prices for August to see changes in the increase or a decrease. It is often also compared to a quarter to quarter, meaning that we compare the first quarter to the second quarter to the third quarter, or third quarter to the fourth quarter. So then it can also compare it in that manner as we compare the inflation rate. So to calculate inflation rate, we say inflation rate equals to the consumer price index or CPI for the current year, which is now, Remember, current year is all about the current prices, which is our nominal prices, minus CPI for base year, which is our previous year prices, and then divided by CPI for the base year, multiplied by 100. So currently in South Africa, our base year is 2015. We use 2015 prices as base year prices. Then we can get inflation rate in this case. And then the following are the types of inflation. So we have the consumer inflation with different types of inflation, and then we have the producer inflation and other types of inflation. So the consumer inflation. Consumer inflation is the sustained increase in general price level of goods and services that consumers pay for in the economy over a period of time. Mainly those goods that consumers are purchasing, then they are under the consumer inflation. And then consumer inflation includes the following types of inflation: the headline inflation or the CPI inflation. It's a headline or CPI. So it is measured through CPI and reflect the cost of basket for goods and services purchased by households. Headline inflation is also known as the CPI inflation. The CPI inflation is the inflation that has not been adjusted. Headline inflation is unadjusted. It includes the effect of mortgage bond or interest rate. Then it becomes the headline inflation. Oppositely, we have the CPIX inflation, which has been adjusted, meaning now it excludes the effect of mortgage bond as well as interest rate. CPIX inflation. CPIX inflation refers to adjusted CPI, which exclude effect of mortgage bond, meaning now interest rates are not the part of the CPIX inflation. That's why we say it is the adjusted inflation. So the question can come, maybe the question can be, why is the headline inflation always higher than CPIX inflation? Headline is always higher because it is not adjusted, while and it also include the effect of mortgage bond, while the CPIX is always lower because it is adjusted. It excludes the effect of mortgage bond. And then we have the core inflation. The core inflation, we also regard it as adjusted CPI inflation because it excludes the effect of goods with highly volatile prices. Those are prices that can increase or decrease over time. It excludes goods with highly volatile prices such as fuel, red meat, etc. Those are goods that can change prices anytime. So we say they are volatile. So they are not included within the core inflation. They are excluded. That's why we say this core inflation is adjusted. Then administered inflation. In this case, we refer to prices of goods and services that are mainly set by the government. We say those prices are administered. So if ever they creep or increase drastically, that creates the administered inflation. Administered inflation or price are prices of goods and services that are set by the government or controlled by government authorities, such as property taxes, sanitation, refuse removal, water, electricity, fuel, paraffin, etc. Those prices are determined by the government on those goods and services. So as they increase, they form what we call the administered inflation for consumers. We continue with the types of inflation, the producer inflation. So in this case, we talk about the sustained increase in the cost of production, over a period of time. So producer inflation is the sustained increase in the cost of production. Remember, this one mainly affects producers, but in the long term, it affects consumers because the cost of production always have an effect on the price of the product within the market, which means that the increase in the cost of production within the manufacturing sector have an effect on the market price that will be charged or that will be asked on that particular product within the market. Producer inflation is measured by the PPI, which is the Producer Price Index. We continue. All-inclusive inflation. So in this case, we talk about inflation calculated in an economy as a whole based on the GDP deflator, whereby current prices are converted to what we call constant prices, or whereby current prices or nominal prices are converted to real prices. Or let's see, GDP deflator is a measure of inflation against specific base year and is used to convert GDP at current prices to GDP at constant prices. So we call that one a GDP deflator because it reduces the effect of inflation, where the previous year is used to discover those prices. GDP at current prices refer to GDP figures that have been adjusted. So current prices, these ones have not been adjusted for inflation, while at constant prices they have been adjusted for inflation, meaning inflation effect has been removed in there. The hyperinflation. So this is the kind of inflation that increase faster to the point that it can be above 50%, resulting to the drastic poverty and decrease in buying power rate of money. This refers to extremely rapid and sustained changes in overall level of prices, 50% per month or more. We regard that one as the hyperinflation. It means that inflation is out of control and its level is not predictable. It is also called runaway inflation. It increases very, very fast. When price levels increase so rapidly that people lose confidence in the value of money, it can be difficult for the economy to operate. So as prices increase, the value of money drops, and that can simply become a constraint to economic growth in that case, because now even investors are not willing to invest in the country where prices can increase in a short period of time. They are not stable. There is no price stability. Price can increase now and then. So investors do not guarantee their benefits or gains in there. So they are not willing to invest in that kind of the economy. Hyperinflation is usually accompanied by an increase in money supply that will result in the currency of the country becoming practically worthless, meaning the money will be mostly available, but that money will be affording less goods and services. So that's why we say it will be worthless. Continues the stagflation. This is the kind of inflation that increases to the point that it results to there is more inflation, lower economic growth, and high level of unemployment. So it stagnates. We call that one the stagflation. Just note, there is high inflation rate, lower economic growth rate, as well as higher unemployment rate. And inflation that prevails when there is a lower level of economic growth, high level of unemployment, and high level of inflation rate. So we call that one a stagflation. It normally occurs due to restrictive monetary and fiscal measures by the government to prevent high level of inflation. The deflation. This refers to the significant decrease in the general price level. So deflation occurs when there is a sustained decrease in general price levels of goods and services, which determines negative trends of inflation, meaning inflation is declining. Then we say it's a deflation. And then we have what we call a disinflation. So a disinflation occurs when there is a reduction in the rate of inflation. In other words, the general price level is increasing at a decreasing rate. As it increases, but increases at a decreasing rate, then we regard that one as a disinflation. And then features or characteristics of inflation. So inflation, it can be caused in two ways. The demand can cause inflation. So it's a part of the characteristics of inflation. The demand can cause inflation. If ever the demand for goods and services increases faster than the supply of goods and services within the economy, that can cause the inflation in the economy. So what can cause the demand to increase within the economy? We look at that now. If ever there is an increased household spending, while there's a lower goods being supplied or produced. Also, if there is more increase in investment spending by businesses, remember, more investment by businesses lead to even further multiplier effect, because there will be even more job creation in the economy, which will increase level of income, and level of income have that effect of increasing the consumption on goods and services, if ever it have increased. And then also the increase in government spending. We know that the higher government projects or investments lead to what? It always lead to the huge multiplier effect, and that simply lead to more income being available within the economy, and the expenditure will also increase drastically within the economy. And then also export earnings. As export earnings increases faster, that lead to more money being made available within the economy, which will lead to more demand on goods and services. Also, if ever the level of savings is declining, that means people are receiving income and they spend the most of their income on limited goods, which will lead to inflation, because as people keep on demanding more, the producers or suppliers will increase their prices to simply curb the effect of the demand. And then also, the inflation can also be caused by the decline in taxes. If ever taxation have been lowered, that give people or consumers the privilege even to demand more goods and services within the economy. And then inflation can also be caused in the other way. The other way around, we say it's a cost push inflation is one of the characteristics and causes. That inflation is basically on the production or within the industrial sector. That's why within the industrial sector we come across maybe the shoplifting. There's a theft. We saw looting happening, and after that we experience the sustained increase in price level of goods and services. So if ever there's a shoplifting, what happens? The producer will always ensure that he or she offset the cost of that shoplifting to the consumer as the end user of the product. If ever there have been some shortages and inefficiencies that happened during the production process, then that will always lead to the producer increasing the price to recover that kind of the inefficiency that occurred when they were producing. And then also, it is caused by maybe high wage demand. If ever workers are demanding more wages, they embark into strike and threaten not to continue with production, and that lead to producers supplying less in that particular period of time. As a result, as they get back to work, prices will be increased to regain the amount of money or profit that were lost during that period of no work. So those are kinds, so they will be explained drastically. So the demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when the demand or aggregate demand increases faster than aggregate supply, meaning there is more demand than the supply, meaning there is more money chasing very few goods in the economy. It is a result of too much money chasing few goods in the economy. So if people are holding on more money, they demand more goods and services, because we know if people are having more money, they are always tempted to spend. As they spend, they demand goods that are not even available, because maybe they demand the large quantity while suppliers can supply less due to supply constraints. The increase in the aggregate supply can be a mechanism to reverse the effect of the inflation, meaning if ever the supply can increase on goods and services, that can lead to reduce inflation, because in this case, the supply can match the demand. We cannot have the situation of having the demand increasing more than the supply. But as the demand increases, the supply can also increase. Then they can match. The effect of inflation cannot exist or cannot occur in that case. A group responsible for demand pull inflation include consumers. They are the main consumer, they are the ones that are demanding goods and services. The businesses, the government, and the foreign sector. For businesses, as they increase their investments, they bring more money into the circulation, which result to employment opportunities, and also there will be more multiplier effect. As the government invests in most of the projects, that will lead to more money being made available in the economy, which will lead to demand. Foreign earnings. As more earnings are received from exports and all other sources, that can lead to more income flowing into the country, as South Africa will be spending on goods and services, while those goods are limited or they are scarce because of supply constraints within the country. And then the causes are increase in consumer spending by the household. That is regarded to PC. The disposable income of household can increase at a faster rate than aggregate supply for three reasons: less savings, reduced taxation, reduced interest rates. So if ever consumers or households are saving less, they spend more on their given income, and that lead to more inflation in that case, because the demand is more while the supply maybe is facing some challenges or constraints. Reduced taxes, reducing income tax and also reducing value-added tax will always have an effect of increasing the demand for goods and services. Reduce interest rates. If ever interest rates are being reduced, loans become more cheap, credit become more affordable. Because of that, the household will be having an opportunity to borrow more money and spend within the economy, which can lead to inflation. Increase employment. If ever the government invests in a sense that will create more employment, especially under infrastructure projects, that can lead to inflation, because these people will be receiving income to spend. High wages. If ever people are earning more wages, obviously they will be demanding more goods and services. So if there are more wages and salaries, as well as accessible credit, if ever the commercial banks or reserve bank is very much lenient on giving credit, or if the credit is more accessible within the economy, that can lead to more money being made available, and then there will be a greater demand for goods and services which are very much scarce or limited within the economy. Investment spending by businesses. Increased profits by businesses may lead to increase in level of investment by business, which have an increasing effect on demand for factory materials, new buildings, machinery, etc. As businesses are reinvesting because of high profits, there will be the greater demand for those goods which are necessary to produce goods and services. At the same time, that will always lead to businesses creating more job opportunities within the economy, which will lead to more disposable income being made available for those people that have been employed. And because of that, they will demand more goods, since disposable income will be increasing on their side. We continue with the causes of demand pull inflation, the government spending. I've said if the government spending increases rapidly, that lead to more projects being made available, which create more job opportunities. And increase in government spending without corresponding rise in the aggregate supply lead to increase in prices. If increased government spending is financed by borrowing from the banking sector, large sums of money are placed into circulation, and the money multiplier comes into operation, stimulating the demand on economy's capacity. So with the money multiplier occurring, that will lead to even further demand for goods and services, which will be a problem, because now as demand increases with supply not increasing, that can lead to increase or sustainable increase in prices in the economy. The foreign earnings. An increase in exports without increase in local production will cause inflation, because goods and services leave the country and reduce the volume of goods available locally. So as goods are exported into the foreign market, while there's a lower supply locally, that will lead to less goods being made available within the country. In that case, the goods and services, or the price of goods and services locally, will be increasing, because if ever there's a lower supply, there will always be higher prices within the economy. Local prices will increase to dampen the local demand. If the demand is increasing drastically, that will lead to prices increasing also, which will reduce the demand for goods and services, due to the fact that there's less supply. Goods are mostly produced and sent to the global market or into the foreign market, and less goods are made available for the domestic economy. Because of that, we come across the effect of the inflation, because the supply declines locally while the demand is more, which lead to the inflation effect. We continue. Reduction in taxes, like we have said, the personal income tax. If personal income tax decreases, household will have more disposable income to demand on goods and services. This increased disposable income result to more money spent on few consumer goods being available in the economy. Accessible credit. Availability of credit in the form of credit cards, personal overdraft, and loans will make it impossible for people to buy things they would not be able to afford from their monthly income. So with the credit being made more accessible, people spend money they don't even have because of the availability of credit. So that simply leads to even further demand for goods and services because of the credit that is made available to almost everyone that can qualify. If the level of production does not increase in the economy, prices will increase due to the scarcity. So goods are limited, the production is not increasing, the demand is more, then the prices will always increase, and resulting to the inflation. Accessible credit is caused by reduced interest rates. If ever interest rates have been reduced in commercial banks, reduced by Southern Reserve Bank, that can always lead to the credit being very much accessible, because now it will be cheap to borrow money from a Reserve Bank, or from commercial bank. Commercial banks can borrow money at the lower cost or at the lower rate from Reserve Bank, and household and all clients will borrow money at the lower rate from commercial banks, and that will increase money supply in circulation, and the demand for goods will be increasing, while the supply is facing some constraints, it's not increasing. So there's more money chasing few goods, and inflation will prevail. More money supply. If ever the Reserve Bank intervene in the economy by applying expansionary monetary policy, that can always increase the money supply. For instance, Reserve Bank decrease repurchase rate, Reserve Bank decrease cash reserve requirement, and then also Reserve Bank buy bonds from commercial banks, and then Reserve Bank relaxes moral persuasion, that can always cause what we call an inflation, because that will lead to more money supply within the economy. The expansionary monetary policy has an increasing effect to money supply. Decrease the repurchase rate, credit reserve requirement, purchase on financial securities from commercial banks, and relaxing on moral pressure increases money supply in circulation and result to increase in aggregate demand in the economy. Remember that demand is increasing at the lower rate of supply for goods and services. Less savings, as consumers are not, as households are not saving most of their income, they spend, and that spending put pressure on the demand. The decrease in level of savings means that more money is spent on purchasing few goods and services in the economy. Increased demand without the increase in supply increases prices significantly. Like I've been saying, if ever the demand is increasing more than the supply, that will always lead to the inflation effect within the economy. And then this is the graph which explains the demand pull inflation. Originally, we have AS, aggregate supply, and AD. And then, as they meet in there, they create equilibrium point, which is E. We have equilibrium quantity, which is Q, equilibrium price, which is P. Now, because of increasing demand caused by the increase in household spending, the government spending, investment spending, and then the foreign sector, less savings, less taxes, less interest rates, more money supply, all of these components are causing the demand to increase while the economy is facing supply constraints. So the supply does not increase, but the demand on goods is increasing. Let's see. This leads to the aggregate demand shifting from left to the right. So from AD to AD1, the demand increases. As the demand kind of shift to the right, with the supply constraint, the supply remains constant at AS, it doesn't shift. So what does that mean? That means the inflation effect, because since the supply remains constant and the demand is increasing, producers will always adjust their prices to dampen the high demand for goods and services. So we experience the increase in prices from P to P1. Prices are increasing, and then the quantity demanded is also increasing from Q to Q1, but the supply remains constant. You can see the supply remaining constant at AS, and the quantity supplied remains at Q. That simply means an inflation effect. This is the same graph being explained. The graph illustrates an increase in the aggregate demand from AD to AD1 and a single aggregate supply, which is AS. You can see AS remains there, but AD increases to AD1. As aggregate demand increases to increases to AD1, the price level of production output will also increase until full employment is reached. The initial increase in the demand will have a positive influence on the production, employment, and income, but when full capacity is reached, further increase in demand will lead to increase in prices of goods and services. Once firms reach that that capacity, or once the market reaches the maximum capacity of supplying their goods and services, that will always lead to increased prices, because now they have less, they are facing scarcity of supply while the demand keep on increasing. The monetarists' view on the inflation. The monetarists believe that inflation is caused by increase in money supply in the economy. So if there is more money supply, there will always be inflation, because the money supply is increasing, which it will lead to more demand, while the supply side is not being made affected expansionary. They have a view that the increase in money supply will cause an increase in aggregate demand on goods and services. An increase in demand without simultaneous increase in aggregate supply will cause existing suppliers wanting more money for their goods and services as the demand exceeds the supply of goods and services. In this case, consumers are willing to pay more because they have more money available with them. They demand more. Suppliers will simply decide to increase their selling prices. Then consumers are also willing to pay more because there is more money in their possession. And then the cost push inflation. So the cost push inflation is the general increase in prices caused by increase in factor inputs. So in this case, we talk about those key inputs within the manufacturing sector that will always affect the selling price of goods and services, inefficiencies and short lifting, including other factors. It is caused by the supply side of the economy, since prices increase as direct result of rise in production cost or input. So I've said before, if ever the cost of production or PPI increases, it always informs changes in prices for consumer goods and services. So if ever the cost of production increases, if the prices for key inputs or factor inputs are increasing, that will mean now producers have to pay more to produce goods and services, meaning that they will offset the burden of that particular higher cost of production to whom? To end users or consumers of goods and services. And that creates what we call a cost push inflation. What causes cost push inflation? The cost push inflation, like I've said before, is caused by the increase in the cost of key inputs, such as machinery, the equipment, the increase in interest rate. Remember, normally businesses will always get capital from commercial banks, maybe in a form of loans, as they borrow money at the flexible interest rate from commercial banks. Then if ever interest rate is increasing, that simply means now the business have to pay more they have to pay more for that particular loan they have taken. Because of that, those businesses have to recover. How do they recover? They increase the selling price for that particular product that they produce with the money that was taken from the commercial bank as a loan. That's what normally happens. So, causes of cost push inflation include wages. This is the most important single cost item in any economy. If ever there are high wages that are paid to workers, at the same time there is a lower production or productivity, that can always lead to the inflation. Wages and salaries constitute up almost 50% of gross value added at basic prices, meaning they are the most important part because workers are paid the most within the manufacturing sector. So if ever these prices are wages are increasing significantly, that cost producers. And how can producers recover this high level of wages and salaries? They need to increase the selling price, which means they offset that burden of high wages to consumers as end users of the product because they are willing to pay. Increasing wages and salaries are a very important cause of cost push inflation. As they increase, producers pay more for cost of production, and then they assemble together the cost of production. They will be charging the selling price or market prices based on the cost of production, which will be higher than at the end. We continue. The key inputs. Cost of imported raw materials. If ever imported raw materials or capital goods or machines are very much expensive, that simply means that businesses will be producing with the expensive capital. So how do they recover that amount of money they paid for that imported capital, which is expensive? They simply do what? They simply increase the selling price so that they can keep in line with their profit margins. So cost of imported raw materials and capital equipment increase due to inflation in supplier countries. When the prices of these key inputs that are imported increase, oil, energy, capital goods, the domestic cost of production will also increase. If ever the cost of machines that are imported is very, very high, that will mean the cost of production in South Africa will also be high because we depend on buying those machines from those countries and they are expensive. If the inflation is very high in that particular country where we import our machines from, that will simply mean the machine will be expensive for us as a country, and that will lead to what? Our cost of production being very, very high. As a result, the inflation will prevail in a form of the cost push inflation. Depreciation of the currency. If the currency loses the value or is being weakened, that will lead to importing key inputs being also expensive for domestic manufacturing sector. As a result, that will always lead to the cost push inflation. A weakening of the rand against the currencies of South Africa major trade partners will mean that more should be paid for imports. As we pay more for imported, especially capital goods and raw material, that will mean that as a country, we are producing at the higher cost of production. As a result, that will lead to the cost push inflation. We continue. Increasing price of machinery or equipment necessary in industrial sectors also increase the domestic cost of production. In turn, producers increase the selling price in order to recover the cost of machines that they have purchased, which is expensive. Profit margins. We know that businesses always set their profit targets very, very high. So for them to reach their profit margins or targets, they always charge higher prices. So high profit targets have a huge impact on increase in selling prices. We continue. When businesses push up their profit margins, they increase the cost of production and eventually the prices that consumers have to pay as manufacturers recover high prices. They had to pay by increasing their prices also. So as producers set high profit margins, that will mean they will be investing more, there will be more capital that they will employ to increase their production. Because of that, what will happen? The cost of production will also increase for them, and as a result, there will also be a higher selling price within the market, costing consumers more, and that will lead to the cost push inflation. A sudden rise in the interest rate will increase interest payment on loans, leading to high cost for businesses. Like I said before, if ever there is increase in interest rates, we know that the capital taken by from commercial banks by businesses will also be expensive, meaning the cost of production will be high because of the increase in interest rates, because interest on loan will be high. Producers offset this high cost through increasing the prices of their prices of their goods and services within the economy. And then we continue the productivity. We know that the rate of the productivity should be more than the rate of wages and salaries. So if ever the wages and salaries increase faster than the productivity, that will lead to an inflation effect. The decrease in the level of production while remuneration per worker remains high will always result to increase in the cost per unit. And then wage increase that are not accompanied by the similar productivity increases also have such effect. If ever wages are increasing more than the productivity, there will also be increasing the cost per unit, which will lead to the inflation. Strikes and stayaways reduce output and cause the drop in supply. So the decrease in supply will always lead to higher prices within the market or within the economy. Natural disasters such as the drought, floods, and even global warming impact on the cost of producers negatively. Food prices are one of the most volatile price items in inflation indexes as a result of the effect of changes in weather patterns. So we know that we depend most on the weather patterns to ensure that we have more food production. If ever we have that global warming as well as climate change, we come across less harvest. Because of that, there will be a lower supply of food within the economy. Then that will lead to higher prices, because as supply drop, that will increase prices in the economy, and that is a part of the cost push inflation. And then the theft or shoplifting. If ever people are stealing from the industry or from the shop or within the market, that can lead to suppliers or producers increasing their selling price to recover the stolen goods to ensure that they keep in line with their profit targets. Theft results to producers losing their profit, for which some of them might not survive in the market. To recover those costs, producers increase their selling prices and the consumer will be affected. High corporate tax or company tax. We know that the corporate tax is always at its incentive, if ever is very high, to investors. Increased corporate tax reduces net earnings by businesses. So businesses increase the level of their revenues by charging more so that they can raise their profit margins. If ever the government charge businesses more company tax or corporate tax, that will mean there will be less net revenues received or earned by businesses. For them to keep in line with their profit margins or targets, they will increase selling prices, which will be affecting consumers. Increase in labor cost. High wage demand increase labor cost and the entire cost of production, because remember, the labor cost is the part of production cost. This will increase asking prices consumers have to pay, which will cause the cost push inflation. If ever the labor cost is very high, that entirely increases the cost of production, which will mean now producers have to increase their selling prices just to recover that higher cost of labor. Increase in price of imported inputs. So in this case, we talk about if ever machines, the technology, and other equipment are very much expensive, or they're imported at the higher cost from other countries. That will mean that those goods being imported as capital goods will make it very much expensive to produce in South Africa, because they are also very much expensive. More money was paid by the producer to import those goods, and then the production for goods and services using those machines will also be expensive. Then producers will always increase selling prices so that they cannot operate at a loss. They will be recovering that high cost of machinery from consumers as they sell them final goods and services. This will in turn increase prices consumers have to pay and increase the cost push inflation. And then this is the graph that indicates the cost push inflation. Remember, I said it is all about suppliers. It's all about supply constraints. It's not about the demand. So let's see. We have original supply curve, original demand curve. Where they meet, we create equilibrium point, which is E, and then equilibrium quantity is Q, and then equilibrium price is EP. And then what happens now? The cost push inflation, it occurs. Maybe the key inputs becomes more expensive to the point that producers find it expensive to buy those machines. So as they buy those machines, what will happen then? The supply will be affected negatively. Some of them cannot afford to bring those machines into the country because of the high cost. So the supply will be declining. So we see the supply declining from AS to AS1. As the supply decline from AS to AS1, we have the new equilibrium point, which is E1 there, where the AD intersect with what we call AS1. The quantity supply declines from Q to Q1, and the price increases from P to P1. This is the effect of the cost push inflation happening. It mainly focuses on the supply constraints. Anything that will prohibit the supply to increase in the market or for goods and services, that it will lead to the cost push inflation. The explanation of the graph. And then cost push inflation is reflected on the upward shape of the AS. This is the one. An increase in the cost of production result in a decrease in the supply. So if the production cost is increasing, the supply will decline as AS shift from AS to AS1. When the supply decreases, it results to higher prices and lower levels of production and income. Cost push inflation has a negative impact on the production, income, and employment. High prices make goods and services less affordable, which means less are sold and produced. This causes lower employment levels within the economy. And then the consequences of inflation. In this case, we refer to the effects of inflation. Now, we have experienced the inflation in two ways: caused by the demand and then caused by the supply constraints. We have those two types of inflation, or those two causes of inflation now we have dealt with. So now, what are the effects of the inflation? As inflation increases, what happens now to relevant stakeholders within the economy? We talk about creditors and debtors. We talk about the poverty and living standards. We talk about industrial peace. We talk about a lot of components that accompanies the inflation that will always be affected by the inflation. Let's see and look at the consequences of inflation. The debtors. Remember, debtors are the ones that are borrowing money from commercial banks or financial institutions. So we normally say debtors benefit at the expense of creditors because they borrow money from commercial banks with more buying power or with more purchasing power parity. The money they borrow at time can afford more goods and services, but as they pay it back regularly year after year, they pay it back with the lower buying power because inflation have increased, especially if the adjustment of interest rate does not benefit the business in future. That lead to debtors benefiting at the expense of creditors, because as creditors they receive this money back as a payment, they receive it with the lower buying power, meaning it can afford less goods and services. Debtors or borrowers receive money with higher buying power and pay back with lower buying power to their creditors. Borrowers benefit from prices increase as they receive the money in a form of loan with more buying power and pay it back in future with the less buying power. During periods of rising prices, debtors gain in real terms because the contract was signed in advance and cannot be changed. Debtors receive the money with relatively high purchasing power parity and repay it back with low purchasing power unless interest rates are sufficient to prevent the situation. And then we check creditors. The creditors or lenders suffer due to the price increase because they get money back with less purchasing power, meaning the money they receive as a payment or as a repayment of a loan is received with less buying power, meaning it can afford less goods and services at that particular period of time, especially if the interest rate has been below the inflation rate. Inflation harm creditors as they lose due to a fall in the real value of money. Changes in the price level affect debtors and creditors differently at the different time or period. That's why I've said debtors will always benefit at the expense of creditors. Debtors benefit, creditors suffer. We continue. Salaries and wages earners. Price increase affect people negatively because their income are relatively fixed. So if ever the income remains fixed or not change at a particular year, that simply means the increase in prices will lead to wages and salaries earners being affected negatively because the money they have over that particular period is losing the buying power, but it remains constant at the same time. It is not adjusted. Real wages fall sharply during the period of high inflation as a result of a decline in the capital stock and a shift in relative prices. Inflation can impoverish large segments of the population by eroding the real wages. Inflation can simply increase and lead to high level of poverty within the society and the economy. Relative wages are the important component of wealth. They constitute the main source of income for many households, especially for the less well-off. So wages are very important because they determine the income to received by people and also affordability. So if they remain fixed while inflation is increasing, that lead to people affording less and that lead to poverty within the economy. The behavior of real wages therefore has a direct bearing on income distribution and the level of poverty. As wages are not increased while the inflation is increasing, that simply lead to poverty drastically and reduce standard of living in the economy. This group includes retired people, pensioners, and the poor. Those people that are earning fixed income are mainly affected by the inflation. Those that are receiving stable income, we talk about retired people, we talk about people that are earning pension. That will experience the erosion of spending power and eventually end too likely to survive. As inflation increases, the demand remains constant, the buying power decreases, they afford less goods and services in the economy, and the poverty increases drastically within the economy. Wage increase are lower than inflation rate increase. If ever there are some adjustments, you find that inflation rate is increasing more than wages, which will mean that that particular increase in the wage level, which is lower, will only recover a certain portion of inflation. Then people cannot be able to sustain themselves. We continue with the consequences. Investors and savers. So we know that some people are investing in some fixed assets, while some are not. So there is a difference between investors and savers. Some people will be gaining, some will be losing. And then assets with fixed nominal value have a fixed return and lower purchasing power as prices increases. So those fixed assets that do not change, they will always be affected negative as the inflation increases. Purchasing power is reduced unless the interest rate is above the inflation rate. People who invest in negotiable instruments such as shares often benefit from inflation because during the periods of inflation, interest rates are increased to encourage savings. So people that invest in paper assets or shares or financial securities will always benefit from the increase in inflation because as inflation increases, it is highly possible that the Reserve Bank will intervene by increasing interest rate, which is of the great benefit to those investors in the indirect investment. And then investors and savers continue. Investors in assets with flexible market value gain while prices are increasing. So those that are investing in the flexible market value will always gain because as inflation increases, interest rate will increase. As interest rate increase, they will also be able to accumulate more on their investments. Often, the prices of these assets increase more rapidly than increase in the general price level. So this means the prices of these assets that are flexible will be increasing more than the increase in the inflation. So it will always give them a benefit. People save money from for long periods with the aim of using these funds to meet future expectations. These savings may be invested as a fixed deposit in the money market as life policies or in pension funds. And then we continue. Now we talk to taxpayers now. How does inflation affect taxpayers? We know that if ever the inflation increases, most of the income goes to the government for taxpayer, especially if the wage or salary earned by the taxpayer is not well adjusted to recover the inflation. Within the inflation, taxpayers nominal income rise through their real income remain unchanged because taxes are levied on the nominal income but not on the real income, and this affects purchasing power rate on taxpayers. So as the taxation increases, that simply means taxpayers will find themselves affording less goods and services if ever their income is not adjusted upward. Taxes are levied on nominal income and not on the real income. If the income tax bracket remain unchanged, inflation increases the average rate of the personal income tax. So we know the income tax bracket. If ever it remains unchanged, inflation increases the average rate of the personal income tax. And then individuals will have to pay higher taxes even if they are actually no better than before. Bracket creep leads to redistribution of income from taxpayers to the government. As the bracket move from one level to another level, that will lead to more income received by the government from taxpayers, which is a greater burden from taxpayers. Industrial peace. We know that if there is a high inflation, normally workers embark into strikes, demanding more wages and salaries, and that will always lead to what? It will always lead to less supply and less production because of strikes. Wage bargaining is accompanied by strikes and mass actions. These actions can sometimes spill over into violence, which affect the society at large. Inflation leads to demands for increased wages as trade unions put increasing pressure on employers to rise wages and salaries. So we know that if ever there are wage demands, normally businesses will stop producing because of workers will be on strike, being in need of more wages, and that will lead to less peace or no peace within the industrial sector because there will be strikes, no production, no supply, economy will be affected. So that is caused by the increase in inflation, which lead to more demand for high wages. So it lead to less peace or no peace within the industrial sector. In extreme situations, in the presence of the exceptionally high inflation together with a government that is determined to not to yield to wage increase demand, which can push inflation to even higher levels, widespread civil unrest will follow. So if ever inflation remains high with government not willing to intervene and reduce the effect and give more wages, that can lead to even further damage within the industrial sector. Continuity, balance of payments. The effect of the high inflation on the balance of payment. If a country's rate of inflation is higher than that of its trade partners, the prices of exported goods increase while the price of imported goods decrease. And then what happens? If the price of imported goods decrease, local consumers will be demanding imported goods and services because they are more affordable, they are cheap, while our local goods are not demanded. And that can lead to the balance of payment being even more vulnerable because there will be greater demand for imports in South Africa. This leads to loss of competitiveness in the export market, leading to a decrease in exports because our goods will appear expensive in the foreign markets, which will lead to even BOP being affected negatively. Cheaper imports have a negative effect on the country's balance of payment because now that can lead to the trade deficit and balance of payment deficit at the same time. The loss of competitiveness can be a result of increased unemployment. And then we continue. Unemployment and poverty. The effect of inflation to the unemployment and poverty. As inflation increases, that simply leads to what? It simply leads to industries producing less because there will be less demand for goods and services. Then what happens? Some people will be working for a few hours at the workplace, and then some workers will be retrenched because of the high inflation due to the fact that there will be a less demand for goods and services that are produced by the firm. And that simply leads to even further poverty because there will be less income earned by workers. At the same time, let's talk of the vulnerable people that are receiving stable income or with no income. As inflation increases, they cannot afford their basic goods and services, which will lead to them living within the absolute poverty or below poverty line. The effect of the inflation are uneven because it does not benefit anyone and harms most, some less than others. And then inflation also tends to redistribute income from low income groups to high income groups. This is because people in the low income groups do not have assets then can rise in the value. So those ones in the high income have assets that can rise because of inflation, but at the lower level, there are no assets that they possess which can rise in the value because of the increase in inflation and interest rates. Powerful groups such as trade unions, large companies, and the wealthy people are able to increase their share of national income at the expense of disadvantaged people such as pensioners, the unemployed, and the welfare recipients. Psychological influence. Low inflation expectations limits excessive wage demands by different labor unions because workers do not expect increase in the cost of living in future, and then also allow consumers to postpone consumption expenditure, thereby reducing the pressure on the price increase. Give household confidence that inflation rate will be low in future and encourage them to save more from their income, thereby controlling excess demand. Reduce panic buying by consumers when they expect that prices will be stable in future. Boost real interest rate, which will encourage savings. Increase in the burden on debtors, which discourages them from borrowing money due to real interest rate. And then we continue with the psychological influence. High inflation expectations. Excessive wage demand by different labor unions because workers anticipate increase in the cost of living in the future will lead to producers increasing the prices in order to recover extra cost of production. So in this case, if ever they assume that there will be more inflation in industrial sector, they will be beginning to start demanding more wages. Then producers will be increasing their selling prices to recover that cost. Prompts consumers to engage in a panic buying when they expect prices to rise. So we know that if ever consumers are expecting higher prices in a particular period, they simply buy more in the short run, trying to ensure that they don't spend more in future. Make households to save less, thereby leading to excess demand for goods and services, which will lead to inflation again in a form of demand pull inflation, because they will be demanding more goods and services as they save less within the economy. Decrease the real interest rate, which will discourage savings. Reduce the burden on creditors as they will receive their money at a higher interest rate. And then now we focus on measures to combat inflation. How can we combat the high level of inflation? As we said, that inflation rate in South Africa is 7.4%. Now it's beyond the target. How can the Reserve Bank intervene using monetary policy? How can the government intervene using the fiscal policy? To combat inflation, restrictive fiscal and monetary policy measures should be implemented. That is done by decreasing the level of demand in the economy, since too much money is chasing few goods and services in the economy. The decrease in the aggregate demand is the pressure on suppliers. So if ever the demand decreases, then the pressure on supply on goods will be relaxed a little bit. That will lead to even less inflation. Fiscal measures to combat inflation. Restrictionary fiscal policy. It occurs when the government intervenes by increasing taxation and decreasing its government expenditure. The government spending. Government should cut down the spending by lowering the rates of salary increases and cancelling some of infrastructure projects, which will lead to less demand and less income available in the economy. Government can decrease its borrowings to finance expenses and its budget, and cut the budget. That can reduce the quantity of money in circulation, which will lead to less demand in the economy. Government through the central bank can buy or sell bonds to increase or decrease the available cash that can be used for consumption. And then we continue with the restrictive fiscal policy. Now we talk of taxation. If ever the tax have been increased, that lead to less demand. So increasing direct taxes such as income tax and property tax to reduce disposable income to curb excessive demand and spending in the economy. Increasing indirect taxes such as VAT and tax on fuel and liquor will increase the cost of living and will reduce the demand on goods and services, and which will lead to less inflation. Implementing surcharges on imported goods will curb spending on imported goods and services. Then that will mean that the demand have been reduced because of that. So before we talk of the monetary measures, we spoke about the government spending being reduced. If ever we reduce government spending to curb inflation, that will lead to less income. Income will be declining. Because of that, remember, disposable income is accompanied by the increase in government spending. So there will be less disposable income because there will be less infrastructure project being given, less employment opportunities. Then the aggregate demand will be decreasing in the economy. Because of the decrease in aggregate demand, that will lead to prices trying to be a little bit flatter, because now the demand might be equal to the supply. The demand might meet the supply because the demand is no longer increasing because of less money being made available in the economy. And then monetary policy measures are measures taken by the central bank to ensure price stability within the economy. Price stability is achieved through decreasing money supply. We know that to decrease money supply, we must always increase interest rate to decrease credit, increase credit reserve to decrease liquidity, and then sell bonds to commercial bank to collect money, which is known as ensuring that there is no money available in the economy, and also tightening moral persuasion or moral pressure. The Central Bank uses Monetary Policy Committee, which is MPC, to monitor changes in CPI and PPI in order to take relevant measures to keep to keep prices good for economic environment. Constructional monetary policy is implemented. And then these are monetary policy measures. Repo rate. We know that if the lending rate or repo rate increases, what will happen? If repo rate increases, all other interest rates that are flexible will be increasing within the commercial sector or commercial banks. Because of that, the credit will become more expensive. Then there will be less loans being taken by borrowers in the economy. As a result, that will lead to less demand for goods and services. These banks would have to charge a higher interest rate on loans and overdraft, making it more expensive for people to borrow money to spend on goods and services. The demand for goods will drop, causing prices to decrease. And then the next one, we talk about the cash reserves requirement or reserve requirement ratio. It should be increased, because if the cash reserve is being increased by the Reserve Bank, that will lead to the decrease in liquidity or money being made available in the banking system. As a result, there will be less loan being created, because now banks will be having less money to create more money. Commercial banks keep most of their revenues in the central bank, which money available for credit creation in the economy. This decreases the aggregate demand and decrease prices in the economy. If ever the demand is decreasing due to the fact that there's less money available in circulation, but the money is kept in the central bank, that can lead to less demand on goods and services, because borrowing will be less or liquidity will be declining in the economy, which will reduce prices significantly. Open market transaction. In this case, the quantitative easing is achieved when the central bank buy financial securities. But now, in this case, to curb inflation, the Reserve Bank can intervene by doing what? By selling bonds or financial securities to commercial banks, so that they will be collecting money. Remember, the money that is kept in central bank is not available in circulation. Therefore, there will be less demand for goods and services. So, to curb inflation, central banks sell bonds to commercial banks to collect money from the circulation, which will leave banks with less money being made available. As a result, there will be less loans being taken, and then also there will be less demand on goods and services. This reduces money supply in the economy, because money in the Reserve Bank is not available for usage. The decrease in the money supply decreases aggregate demand on goods and services. And then we talk about the moral persuasion or moral suasion. So availability of credit increases demand for goods. If ever a Reserve Bank instruct commercial banks to be very much relaxed as they give credit, or to make credit more accessible, that will lead to inflation. However, if the Reserve Bank is restrictive, it can instruct commercial banks to be very much strict as they give credit within the economy, which will reduce the level of credit creation in the economy. Then people cannot afford to spend reckless in the economy because of less credit creation. The central bank tightened moral persuasion to reduce inflation. It instructs commercial banks to be stricter when creating credit if inflation rate is above its maximum target, which is 6%. Commercial banks are instructed to act in the manner that is suitable for the prevailing economic conditions. So if ever the inflation is above the target, they must be strict on giving out credit into the economy, which will reduce spending in the economy. Inflation targeting. So central bank set inflation targets and applies measures to meet this target. So setting inflation target is one of those measures to ensure that inflation is within the limit, does not increase beyond the target or beyond the limit. It is believed that by setting the target, inflation expectations of consumers, producers, employers, and the workers will be reduced, and that they will behave in such a way to achieve the set target, because they know that inflation targeting is there, so inflation cannot increase beyond and cannot also decrease below. This raises the cost of credit and reduces the availability of credit to the various sectors in the economy. And then how can you combat the cost push inflation? There must be increased productivity. We know that if ever there is more productivity being produced or being made available in the economy, that can lead to relatively lower prices, because higher productivity means more supply of goods and services. Then that will lead to less prices in the economy. Increase in factor productivity are the best option to increase supply and reduce prices. We know that as the supply increases, prices will drop in the economy. Wage increase need to be accompanied by the productivity increase in order to keep prices relatively low. So if ever wages are increasing, like I've said before, the productivity must also increase faster so that prices will be relatively lower. Human resource development. In this case, we talk about improving education and training. If ever people are trained, if people are skilled enough, they tend to be productive citizens. They tend to be marketable. So it is very important that we use some supply side measures to ensure that the supply is increasing so that we can combat the cost push inflation. It forms a very important part of the structural measures to improve the supply side of the economy. Improvement of technology. We know that if technology is well improved, that simply leads to what? It leads to more productivity at the short period of time, which increases the supply. As a result, prices can drop. Technology can increase production and accurate supply to release the pressure on prices. And then the competition. We know that if ever the competition is being increased in the economy, that leads to the production of more goods and services and the increased supply. Because of that, the pressure on prices can be relatively lower. The best method for keeping a check on profit margins is to ensure competition domestically and internationally. Encouraging competition is one of strategies applied in the fight against inflation, because its greatest advantage is competitive prices. If ever there is more competition, then prices tend to be very much competitive. Less government intervention easily attract foreign direct investments into the economy, which increase the production within the country's economy, and that production will always lead to more supply and relax the pressure on prices in the economy. Import controls. Tightening import control negatively impact on the cost of production. This decreases competitiveness of businesses. It is therefore important for the government to implement fair import control measures to avoid inflating production costs. If ever there are more import control, that lead to those key inputs becoming more expensive in South Africa. Because of that, that lead to more inflation. So they should be relaxed a little bit. And then evaluation of South African inflation target. Remember, the past two, the consequences of inflation as well as measures to combat, those are two essays as for our current examination guidelines. Success factors on the inflation. It has been able to curb the demand pull inflation by limiting consumption through application of restrictive policies, both fiscal and monetary. Inflation target give confidence to investors as they remain confident that prices will remain stable within a certain period of time. That's why we're about to call the target by the government as a macroeconomic objective, that we call the price stability. So if ever the price stability is achieved through inflation targeting, it tends to be easy for investors to be attracted into the local economy and invest, because they know that prices will not be increasing over time. Make consumers to feel secured about future inflation rates. It reduces economic uncertainties, which create a platform for sound economic growth. There will be even more economic growth because of the inflation targeting, because those stakeholders are fully aware of the changes in inflation. As much as it will change, it cannot be beyond the target. Promoting accountability for South African Reserve Bank by ensuring that it adjusts interest rate if inflation rate goes below or above the target rate that has been set. Failures. Inflation targeting was introduced to control demand pull inflation rather than the cost pull inflation. So this inflation targeting is there, but measures that are mostly used, those are measures to combat the demand pull inflation. For instance, measures that have been taken by the central bank was to increase interest rate. What if the inflation we are facing is not the demand pull inflation, is the cost pull inflation, but we are simply combating the demand pull inflation by restricting the demand while people are living within the poverty, while people are not affording their basic life. So it becomes a challenge because these measures that are created, that are used by the government and the central bank, mostly are combating the what you call the demand pull inflation. They are not mainly focused on the supply unless the government intervene by reducing the interest rate on investors, and then unless the government intervene by also improving the supply by supporting businesses to produce more goods and services, then the cost push inflation can be challenged in that case. Cost push inflation is caused by factors that fall outside the control of the monetary policy. Yes, those factors are not the part of the monetary policy, that they're outside. So as we combat inflation, we only combat the demand pull with some of measures to combat inflation which are known to be monetary measures. Prices of key imports cannot be managed by inflation target, and they increase prices on final goods excessively. Inflation target result to economic strain when existing inflation is cost push, but central bank use measures to combat the demand pull inflation. So this is just an example of an essay that you can come across. We have seen this one in the examination. According to our examination guidelines, we have this essay which says discuss in detail the consequences of inflation, basically on debtors and creditors, wages and salaries earners, investors and savers, taxpayers, industrial stability, industrial peace, unemployment and poverty, balance of payment, and psychological influence. We have done this essay in a form of explanation. And then the other one is measures to combat inflation. So it says discuss in detail measures to combat inflation. So this can be either demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. We talk about monetary measures, fiscal measures, and other measures. So those essays have been responded to above, but let's simply see the manner at which you can see, the essay can prevail. Discuss in detail the following consequences of inflation: debtors and creditors, investors and savers, taxpayers, industrial stability. Then additional part was how successful is the fiscal policy as a measure to combat inflation. And then these were possible responses. Introduction obvious, defining the inflation as a sustained increase in general price level. So introduction is always for 2 marks. Any other correct and relevant definition or response can be taken in a form of introduction. And then we talk of debtors and creditors. That's when now we go into depth. Remember, if this was given as a heading, it cannot be created a mark because it was given. Debtors benefit because they receive money with high buying power parity and pay it back with lower buying power parity, while creditors on the other hand lose because they give money with more buying power as a loan and receive it back as payments with lower buying power. And then investors and savers. We talk about assets with fixed nominal values in here. A large portion of the wealth of individuals is held in the form of fixed value. Fixed interest yields claims such as fixed deposits, company debentures, and government bonds. These assets have a fixed nominal value and give a fixed return, meaning with the change in inflation, change in interest rate, the return remains fixed. So they don't benefit, but those ones with the nominal values or flexible values will always benefit as the inflation increases, because it is believed that interest rate will be increasing to benefit them and accumulate even more. Investors and savers. We continue assets with flexible market value. This is the one I was talking about, to say those that are investing most on shares will always benefit because now as inflation increases, interest rate might increase, which will lead to them accumulating even more money on their investments. So remember, as you answer, you provide the full sentence. That will be giving you 2 marks for the full sentence with the complete economic sense. Often the prices of these assets increase more rapidly than increase in the general price level. So that gives you 2 marks. In this case, inflation creates wealth to the advantage, and those holding such assets. So those people will always benefit from inflation because they are holding those assets with flexible returns, not with fixed returns. Taxpayers. In South Africa, income is taxed in a progressive tax system. And then the high income earners will always pay more tax, and low income earners will always pay less tax. With inflation, taxpayers' nominal income rises even when their real income remains unchanged. If income tax schedule remains unchanged, inflation increases at the average rate of personal income tax. And then individuals will have to pay higher taxes even if they are actually no better or they receive less income. We experience a bracket creep resulting from inflation and progressive income tax, and the government benefit the most on that. Industrial stability, we know that wage bargaining accompanied by strikes will always lead to what? Lead to businesses supplying more. Supplying less of goods and services because of the strikes. Because of that, the business might decide to do what? To increase those wages. But then it takes time. So it leads to less peace being made within industrial sector because of what? Because of strikes that go on. Some of them will take for 3 months, the period of 3 months. Some will even take more period, which means the production remains constant, the supply remains constant. So the industrial stability is affected negatively because of that. These actions can sometimes spill over into violence, which affect society at large. We know we have seen that people being killed because of strike. While they're striking, some lose their lives. So that lead to even violence. In other, correct relevant response was accepted for 26 marks. And then there was also additional part asking the effectiveness of fiscal policy to combat inflation, increasing direct taxes to reduce disposable income of consumers, increasing indirect taxes, VAT, and custom duties to increase the specific prices and also cap demand of goods and services, reducing government spending to reduce the disposable income of goods and services, and then improving worker productivity through training and skills and training or education at itself. Continuity, and then increase VAT from 14% to 15%, leading to general price increasing and VAT increasing. Also levied on basic services, e.g. electricity and water. Increase government spending, leading to increase in aggregate demand, which could fuel or cause more inflation. Increasing bailout of parastatals and financial discipline, very poor in parastatals. Increased social spending, e.g. grants without productive services being rendered. So all of these are coding what you call the inflation. So it has not been successful because of doing these things. If ever VAT have been increased, when it was increased from 14 to 15%, it resulted to the cost push inflation. The increase in government spending trying to reduce poverty lead to increase in aggregate demand within the economy, and also increasing bailout to parastatals, and also giving more money or transfers into the society without any service being rendered, result to more demand on goods and services, which can also result to the inflation. In other, correct relevant response was given 2 marks in full sentence. And then remember, you must always provide the full sentence. You must provide 5 facts that will give you enough marks. In this case, you get only 2 marks for mere listing. And then conclusion. Remember, this should be the higher order response. And then inflation must be carefully monitored and controlled so that it can have a minimum effect on the economy. In South Africa, the government uses both fiscal and monetary policy measures to try and combat or control inflation. So any other correct and relevant response which is of the higher order was accepted for 2 marks. Remember, in the conclusion, you don't repeat the content that you have mentioned above. So ensure that to become authentic and critical. So this is one of those essays that are in our new or 2021 examination guideline. So ensure that at all times you in each topic you track those essays that are possible according to the examination guideline and prepare yourself to that higher level, because we know that if you know an essay, you have that confidence towards the question paper. So with all of this being said, I thank you, and I believe this lesson will have a great impact as we prepare for preparatory examination. Thank you.